Thanks. Okay, thanks everyone for being here. This I'm gonna show you this brief work that we did last year, that we published last year, along with my colleague Kira. More than extracting street networks, what we try to do is try to classify street networks and trying to replicate it using all these variational autoencoders. There are two parts from this presentation. One is, of course, training and the clustering of the street networks, and the other one is the decode of the street networks. In these minutes, I'm going to speak about the first part only. As many of you know, street networks are ubiquitous worldwide, and we've been using it for many things here in our group in the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis in UCL. From trying to define cities in terms of the extensions of their morphology, trying to classify cities in terms of the morphology of the street networks. So we've been using it a lot of time. As you can see in the image above, these street networks came in many ways and in different forms. This idea of trying to classify cities from the way of how these structures, these urban structures, have been evolving through time. So this Cetori Price image that you can see that it's been around for a while, trying to tell us that how these cities have been evolving through time, from when they were like a monolithic structures with probably a wall around them, to this idea of the sprawl that we have now, where we no longer have a single center that can relate it to the whole city. And in this spirit is what we try to take these street networks and try to see how they can relate it with this image, and they've been evolving through time. Just as a few examples, we have cities like this that, if you can see in the sort of the west part, we see a more grid structures, while in the northeast part we have a more curvy lines that came, and in the middle probably a big park or plaza. So we have structures like this, and of course we have structures like your typical American suburban city, where the large driveways and large and concentric one sort of shopping centers. We have cities that seems very similar to each other in terms of the street networks, like Cali, Athens. We have cities like, of course, where we are doing the research in London, that has a very different. As you move across the city, you will find different type of structures. Yep. So the whole idea is that you see all these street networks, and well, let's try to use one of these machine learning mechanisms called variational autoencoders to see if we can classify these street networks. There are, as you may know, there are two main approaches to generative models. One is the ones that someone else been talking about, GANs, generative adversarial networks, and of course the VAS, the variational autoencoders, and it's the second one that we're using here because of this marvelous latent space. This is of course, this is your typical variational autoencoder architecture, when you have your input data and you put it through different layers that in this current convolutional neural networks, and you came to this purple bit that is the latent space, where all the information about your input is encoded there. And then, of course, the second part is the coder that we are not speaking in this part. The latent space is one of these weird, marvelous things that can lead you to actually represent the characteristics of an object, of phenomenon, but also has a lot of things there that could be think as weird, because it all depends of what you are saying that really characterize your object. Particularly with images, in this type, these images trying to get rid of all these features in your typical variational autoencoder and your typical mechanism, try to get rid of, for example, of the color or something like that. But in terms of the street networks, which are the characteristics that we can get rid of? As an input data, we use a little bit more than 12,000 binary images that are only 63 by 3 kilometers pieces of street networks, and we encode that in something that we call urban vector networks that go down to half of the original images in the encode part. So we are not really trying to classify this city like this. That would be really hard. We end up with pieces of cities. When we say that we are comparing cities, that's not entirely true. We are comparing centers of cities from the geographical centroid. So we get these 12,000 cities, we get the centroid, and then we do a square by 3 kilometers around the centroid, and that's our input from our data. I'm going to skip this part really hard because this is we are not doing anything fancy here. We are using standard mechanisms for the encoder and decoder, your reconstruction loss, your Kullback convergence to regularize and see the distance about the things that you are encoding. So nothing new here. The new thing we thought is the actual input data. So at the end, in the latent space, we get, of course, with latent vectors, and we simply measure the Euclidean distance between two latent vectors in the usual way. So can you see in this image? You can see by rows, by columns, sorry, how image they are more similar, going to left to right, you find less similar images, and this is measured by the distance, by the Euclidean that we have there. And again, this is all pieces of centers of cities. As you can see in the bottom right, of course, I don't know which city is that, but it's only one simple line, and that's what we get there. I forgot to mention that we get all these images from OpenStreetMap, so it's still the issue of the quality of data. In larger cities, we have really good data, you have really good street networks, but in other type of cities, you don't have that. So at the end, we cluster the cities. We cluster the cities in terms of these distances, and we define with the Kempinska 3 clusters. This is the type of cluster that you get. So you can see in those images, the first 4 images clustered together, the second set clustered together, and the third set clustered together. So in terms of these type of images, the clusters and the distance are we're getting somewhere with these clusters. And I think the message that I want to give you here is these next images. So after we cluster these 12,000 cities, each color represents a cluster. You can see how somewhere these centers of cities for Asian cities clustered together, larger cities that are in red, that are represent this one, the first, the ones in the left panel, that are the most dense cities in terms of the center city, clustered together. You see larger cities all over the place clustered together, and of course the medium-sized cities again are there. So this is what we got. This is what we got with these cities. Of course, you can go and change the number of clusters. and you get six clusters there with different types of morphologies. And this is when you go to the decode part, this is what you get. But I'm not speaking of that, because you can see you get these decoded forms, and you can see all these type of monsters there. Some are good, some are not that good. But I think the message is this one, that after input all these images into these variational autoencoders, and measuring the distance in the latent space, we are able to see some structure in there. So yeah, it helps us classify cities, yes, of course. But the main issue is here that all these are images only. There is no topology there, no topology whatsoever. Okay. So that's still an issue, a real issue that we have there. And of course, the nature of the machine learning implies that we don't actually understand this latent representation, what they are doing there. All the code that we use in this research can be accessed there at the GitHub from Kira, and I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Well done. Thank you for your patience. Really quick, yeah. Okay, so we don't really have time to ask questions in chat, but I'll just have a quick one before we move on to the next presentation. So what's the next step? How do you go from the images to the topology? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, first we need to, what we've been talking about is how do we get rid of the images. So instead of having input images, how we can input a network structure there. So how do you go from this representation of taking pieces in each convolutional neural network, that you are reducing the dimensionality of the pixels, instead of reducing the dimensionality in terms of pixels, how we reduce the dimensionality in terms of network structure? It's another question still, you see.